So it's a real delight today to introduce our speaker, Jim Lowe, who's a local hero, of course, here at Egenis, and in fact, a longer standing member of Egenis than I am, because Jim was here and we had lots of, I remember lots of really great discussions in the biological interest group, or BIG, which doesn't even exist anymore, which shows how long both of us have been doing this now, has changed into the Exeter Research Exchange. So Jim did his PhD with Stefan Muller and Sophia Leonelli. And then after that, I had a postdoc with Gail Bayes on in vivo methods, and then was away from us in Edinburgh for quite a few years. So for about 6 years, I think. At first as a fellow, and then a senior fellow on the project, the Transgene Medical Translations and the History of Modern Genomics. Which resulted in a book, which is co-authored with, I guess, the PI of that project. Yes, so Causal AI, called The History of Genomics Across Species, Communities and Projects with Carl Macmillan. And then in 2023, he came back to Exeter and was postdoc on the Renew project, which several people, as Angela Cassidy was also involved in. And then the year after that, took on a present role in the CHI project, which I know was back engineered to come up with a lovely acronym. It feels like it should be, the word should be in a different order, basically, but I entirely understand why this was done. So, Causality in Healthcare AI, CHI project with Nicola Zampini. So it's lovely to welcome Jim today to give the seminar on constituting variables and causal AI.
Thanks very much. So also the book that Adam mentioned is available open access, and there's a leaflet out there. So if you're interested, just have a look at that. So obviously to be made tractable for scientific investigation, the variation that exists in nature or can be sort of generated through particular manipulations needs to be transformed into a variable. And the aim of today's talk is to set an agenda for research into constituting variables. So the ways that variables can be defined, identified, incorporated into models and investigative systems, related to other variables and used. And I'll do that as is clear from the title in the context of causal AI, particularly causal AI in healthcare. Causal AI being a set of approaches that seek to embed causal principles, causal modelling and methods, the apparatus of causal inference into AI models and modelling, with the aim of using the power of AI, but correcting for some of its deficiencies and augmenting some of its strengths. And so to do that, I'll start by outlining the motivation behind the articulation of constituting variables as a particular angle for examining practices associated with variation in the life sciences, outline why that might be significant, detail, I think, the ways in which causal AI can be quite a valuable area to look at this, look at some examples within causal AI, and then draw out some features and implications, again, setting that agenda for further investigation. There we go. So, as Adam mentioned, I'm part of the Causality in Healthcare AI Hub with Nicola here in Exeter. It's a multidisciplinary, multi-institution hub, people in Edinburgh, Manchester, London just part of the core team, but there's a wider array of collaborators, co-investigators, and so forth. The aim being to sort of design and deploy causal AI innovations into healthcare scenarios. And part of that is the explicit modelling of scientific knowledge to make AI models more sustainable, scalable, reliable, robust, to changes in context away from the original training and testing domains. In doing so, to diagnose and address issues associated with fairness and equity, and to ensure that AI models and their outputs are more transparent, and that healthcare AI is more trustworthy as a result. And a key ambition at the heart of CHI is the co-creation of scientific and ethical excellence. And just to sort of say a little bit more about that, I won't go into too much detail about the model of governance that we're sort of developing in CHI, the model of anticipatory governance. That's probably a talk for another day, but it relates to the way that we engage in the rest of the hub. We're very keen not to partition our activities away from our more natural scientific and technical and engineering colleagues, but to use our engagement with their work, the problems that they encounter, the the challenges that they're trying to meet in order to sort of intervene, bringing our ways of working, ways of thinking, qualitative methods, in order to sort of inform our engagement with those issues and try to sort of extend and identify some of the implications of them and work through them. Another example of this is in our work on validation of clinical prediction models. But if you want to hear a little bit more about that, then come on to the Exeter Research Exchange on Monday next week. So that's one source, is engaging with some of the ways in which some of our colleagues and collaborators within CHI engage with the issue of what falls under the bracket of constituting variables. Another source is the sort of wider history and philosophy of social studies and biological variation group, of which I'm a part. Apologies for the size of the pictures. Of course, when I'm on my computer screen, they don't look quite so big, but now they're blaring out. So the aim here is to sort of forge a coherent endeavour to characterise and understand biological variation and its place in scientific investigation of the life sciences in a wide array of frameworks. And this is another source where it's obviously my interest in constituting variables is stoked in part by my wider interest in the treatment and conceptualisation of biological variation. It's obviously informed my thinking about how I approach causal AI with that. So that's just to give a bit of background on my motivation for exploring this issue. So what is the constitution of variables? So just starting back, that's a bit of a button stick there we go. No, we've gone far beyond that. There we go. I wish I hadn't done slides like this. Okay. So what are variables? No, that's far beyond where I wanted to. Let's use the keyboard here. There we go.
If you were a visitor, Jim, I'd apologise for the technical problems, but we all do it.
Yes. So obviously a basic definition of variation in biology, differences between equivalent biological objects or processes. And as Dan Nicholson, formerly of this manner, has observed, variation is a primary, irreducible and inescapable feature of the living world. And a corollary of that is that essentially all sort of practices associated with and conceptualization associated with variation is central to the life sciences and obviously allied translational domains such as medicine, agriculture, and so forth. There's, two quotes over a century apart from very different figures. So William James obviously identified that every reality has an infinity of aspects or properties. We can identify essentially infinite aspects of variation in the living world or even the non-living world. And over a century later, yeast biologists grappling with functional analysis of the newly sequenced yeast genome, basically having sort of deletion strains, they call it, of yeast, whereby certain single or multiple combinations of genes would be deleted in order to try to ascertain their functional impacts on the organism. And they would do these experiments in the context of all sorts of growth conditions. And as these yeast biologists observed, as there is an infinite number of possible growth conditions, it will be impossible for any systematic effort to analyse any given deletion strain comprehensively. And we might add also to actually assess the actual combination of deletions. It wouldn't be infinite, but it would probably last to the end of the universe, trying to actually characterise every single combination. So there are a number of different ways one can sort of identify variation in the world and sort of capture and apprehend and identify variation that's relevant to a particular domain of interest, a particular question or problem. And that also goes, that also goes for variables as well. And the philosopher Benjamin Jansen has observed that despite their central role in science, variables have received scant direct attention and remain remarkably obscure. They're not simple predicates, they're not abstract, they determine or cause other variables, and crucially, they need to be identified, discovered, or constructed depending on one's metaphysics. Whatever the appropriate verb, the world does not manifest itself to us with variables given. And so they need essentially to be constituted, they need to be identified, apprehended, and operationalized in some way and used in integrated into particular forms of scientific activity. So again, a very broad basic definition, variables are essentially characteristics that vary between comparators. It obviously has relation with kind of concepts such as characters in taxonomy. They take a number of different forms, and here I'm going to go back to the keyboard. So just basic examples. They could be concentrations of particular proteins, and they may vary. For example, each of these is a different species, but they're clonal colonies of those microbes. And as you can see, the variation of those proteins, as depicted by the different colour of them, varies between the individuals there due to the role of noise. It can be the number of sensory bristles on a Drosophila melanogaster, for example. It can be anything, and they can take obviously different forms. The forms that they can take that are sort of contextual forms of, obviously we can have independent variables, dependent variables, the different roles of variables that manifest in causal graphs, and obviously they can take different forms in the sense. I'm going to give up on that. They can take different. Oh, it has. Okay. Well, I'm still going to stick with
That's almost worse than it not working.
It is. Yeah.
Sorry.
That's all right. So they can also be quantitative, continuous or discrete. They can be qualitative or categorical. Nominal, ordinal, depending on their status, that can be ranked or not. So nominal might be the sort of colour. Ordinal would be a kind of ranking. Some form of ordering of them, and of course the quantitative variables can actually be transformed into categorical variables, for example through the use of thresholds, cutoffs, cutting up the quantitative into categories, obviously if one has the basis for them. And there are obviously a number of uses to which variables can be put, which I won't go into, but this is not exhaustive, but it gives you an idea, and we're particularly going to look at some of those on the right hand side there, prediction, intervention, counterfactuals. Now, obviously, Jansen said that there's been scant attention, but there obviously has been some attention to variables in the humanities, social sciences, philosophical literature, and so forth, including Jansen himself. So distinguishing scientific variables are the kinds that I've mentioned already from logical or number variables, on ways in which variables can be derived from other variables. The definition of variables and criteria for determining which variables are well-defined or ill-defined in terms of being able to actually estimate causal effects from them. Variable choice in the context of, in terms of Woodward's case, the kinds of variables that should be included if one wants to sort of in a particular model for the purposes of causal explanation. And he has various criteria for that, obviously associated with the ability to sort of manipulate these causes and having more or less direct effects on the potential outcomes. And Colin Rice, who has really emphasised the tyranny of availability in shaping the kinds of variables that are selected. So the tyranny of availability in terms of available data, the available sort of modelling resources available to usually specific scientific communities that have maybe been working on a particular experimental system or a particular issue to which they have sort of entrenched methods and approaches and sources of data over a long course of time. There's the identification of the role of variables, so how to identify appropriate independent variables. The operationalization of variables, for example, in the example of Sarah Richardson's work on the operationalization of sex as a biological variation when one needs to consider, for example, in animal model research, the importance of sex differences. And in more research in a more sort of STS vein about the entrenchment of variables, the use of historic data sets and the consequences of historic data sets and the data labels, categories and so on that are associated with those that can often be entrenched in practice due to the need for sort of ongoing comparability, consistency, interoperability and so forth, which can lead to sometimes inappropriate sort of historical theory and assumptions working their way into existing and modern data sets and that being entrenched. So that's just a little example of some of the literature that I think captures individual specific aspects of what I'm looking to capture with constituting variables, which is a fuller technical, methodological, conceptual, practical and social organizational array of means by which variables sort of work their way, find their way into given investigative systems, used in those, evaluated and maybe change over time. And that obviously includes all the things that have just popped up around there. And it seems that a more holistic approach to dealing with this would be required to understand and evaluate the source, use and consequence of particular variables and sets of variables for specific epistemic goals. in order to help diagnose and particular problems that might be associated with that particular set of variables and potentially propose remedies. And I think that would require a framework for doing so across a number of different domains. So what would be the value of causal AI? So I think this is a useful place to start to try to set this agenda, to identify key aspects of the constitution of variables and avenues that merit further explanation. And I want to stress that's not because I think it's necessarily representative of the constitution of variables in different fields. I mean, for example, what Colin Rice is looking at is a field where some of the things I'm going to talk about are not necessarily as applicable because you've got a large number of entrenchment of data methods and so forth, but it hopefully sort of identifies things for further investigation. So why causal AI? So often causal AI advocates articulated in contrast to existing AI methods that largely rely or sort of identify statistical associations in data sets. And the problems with this is that they actually import many of the biases of data sets in terms of what is actually recorded in those data sets, what is in the data sets, what isn't in the data sets. And this, as we know, can lead to unfair and inequitable outcomes in various ways. It can be produce result because it's sort of picking up on correlations rather than actual causal relationships. It can manifest in hallucinations, so essentially falsehoods that are popped out. So a familiar one will be that a student essay where references that just don't exist pop up, and they can be subject to adversarial attacks whereby essentially the structure or the sort of inference mechanisms of the model can be inferred by malefactors who can then exploit those to get sort of unintended disastrous results. So that could be sort of like engineering a couple of pixels in an image to make it classify. So the image classifier classifies it as something completely different to what it is, for example, or make Uber's crash and so forth. They often exhibit, because they are just picking up largely picking up statistical associations in the training data sets that may not be representative of other populations or phenomena. They often have poor outer domain generalizability when they're applied to a different domain because they're essentially transposing the statistical associations in the original population rather than something that's a bit more fundamental. We know they're resource intensive, they lack transparency in terms of how they reach their outputs, and they don't allow exploration of counterfactuals. And to talk a little bit more about that issue, you may probably have seen this diagram before, presented by Judea Pearl, one of the pioneers of the field of causal inference. And he essentially argues that existing machine learning is stuck at the level of association, finding sort of patterns and correlations and links between things. The problem with that is, of course, is that for most purposes to which we want to put things, we need to actually know causal effects for planning for policy making, particularly in healthcare. This kind of predictive approach may be useful in some domains. It's useful, for example, in selective breeding in some circumstances where you don't really need to know the causal effects, but where it actually matters if you make an intervention and there's disastrous effects on society, people die and so forth. So you need to actually identify causal effects. So this is the level of essentially controlled experiments, randomized control trials and so forth. And the idea being is that causal AI, however, is at the higher level, at least for Pearl, of counterfactuals. So what would have happened if a particular exposure, a particular sort of cause had actually been changed in value? Something had happened or hadn't happened or happened in a different way. And the idea behind this is that causal AI can be very, very useful when one can't actually conduct a randomized control trial or some kind of controlled experiment. And then we may only have real-world data or observational data available, and we need to actually estimate the counterfactuals based on the observational data to see, well, actually, if we change X, what will happen? What should happen to Y? And that's the basic principle behind causal inference and how that should be applied in terms of causal AI. And often the way that's done is through constructing directed acyclic graphs or causal graphs of various kinds. This is obviously just one example. Also, an associated structural causal models. And these can be used to identify the roles of variables among a set of variables and the different sort of causal and other paths. So this is obviously just a very simple example where you've got an exposure, a sort of supposed cause, and an effect, an outcome or effect, and two other variables that, as you can see, are causing both the exposure and the outcome. And the initial thing upon drawing a DAG, and I'll come into drawing DAGs in a second, is that obviously one can identify the treatment or exposure and the outcome, but also once that's done, the characteristics of other variables in the graph can be identified. So for example, these two that are causing both the treatment and the outcome can be labelled as confounders, but you can also identify, so they're essentially common causes. Then there's colliders that are common effects and mediators that are essentially on a separate intermediaries on a separate causal pathway. And so what DAGs allow, provided that they meet certain assumptions and that the causal effect can actually be causal estimation, the estimation of causal effect can be made from them, is they allow you to identify the different roles of variables. They allow you to identify what statistical control measures are needed and crucially are not needed, because there are some, for example, colliders that you don't necessarily want to control. And this then allows you to sort of identify causal estimates from supposedly from observational data. And I'll go into a little bit more about how they're drawn in a second, but I'll just show you some. Ooh. Yes, there we go. So this is just one example of one, and you'll know, some can get more complex than that. Most of the examples that you get in the sort of basic literature are sort of even simpler than that. But it's essentially the arrows only go in one direction. There can't be sort of cycles back, and crucially, as you may sort of observe with the drawing of breath, that you try and include as many variables that are relevant to the outcome as possible, even if you've not necessarily got the data on them yet, because there are measures that you can do if you've got, for example, confounders for which you don't have data on. There are sort of control measures, adjustments you can make based on that, based on the sort of the role of the variables, the structure of the causal pathways, and so on, which I could go into if anyone's interested. But that's just one random example. So in terms of the Chai project, it's not completely captured by these 4 headings, but it gives a sort of a broad idea and it introduces some of the things I'll talk about in a second. So again, the idea is being able to use complex real data or observational data and so forth that may be held in different forms in different places, can be noisy, messy, and not necessarily well structured. So one avenue of work is in causality for machine learning. So this is essentially the idea that rather than just relying on statistical associations in the data, if one was able to identify causal relationships and causal graphs and embed those into AI models, then you're less likely to suffer a poor outer domain generalization. You're much less likely to have decline in the performance of a model drift. And especially, and you can't see this very well, but it doesn't necessarily matter. Ways of actually characterizing the different ways into which the data that will enter into the system, the observational data that will enter and be used essentially to do the causal estimates, conduct the causal estimation, can be analysed as well causally in terms of the different kinds of shifts that might occur. So you might have differences in population, you might have differences in the way that data is recorded, annotated. You might have differences in the prevalence of a disease and so forth, and capturing those aspects to essentially make models much more robust and generalizable than they currently are. Large-scale causal discovery is essentially using structured data in order to learn causal graphs, and we'll talk a bit more about that in a second. Causal representation learning is using more unstructured multimodal data, such as imaging data, to do the same thing and to use that to estimate causal effects and identify sources of bias. And then causal reasoning for decision support is essentially, again, using observational data, causal graphs in order to estimate the causal effects of particular treatments, and crucially also in the field of clinical prediction models, where they'll give you a sort of risk score for a particular condition, like the risk of developing cardiovascular disease over the next 10 years, for example, and that can inform whether you go on statins or not. And in fact, actually, oh yes, of course, I've got that as the next slide. So this is the Chariot project as part of this, and this is, by the way, it looks like a DAG, but it isn't a DAG. So it's just an example where actually certain other causal graphs are possible as well. The idea being is that you get a risk score based on these kinds of parameters when you go to hospital or something with some kind of condition that might suggest that you might be at risk of cardiovascular disease, and then you get a risk score. But then, of course, you want to know what happens if you change one of these aspects of your lifestyle. You reduce weight, you have fewer HDL cholesterol and so forth. What would be the effect of that on your risk? And this is called prediction under intervention. Again, it's using the principles of causal inference in order to improve these kind of risk scoring procedures and do counterfactuals. So what is the value of causal AI? For looking at the constitution of variables. So we've got explicit modelling of variables and their relationships. You've got explicit articulation either in the form of the graph or in the mathematics that accompanies it of the assumptions that you're making behind when you're making causal estimations based on the graph. There are obviously certain conditions it must adhere to as well. There's a focus on causally modelling data practices in a given domain to identify the sources of shifts that may affect the performance of the model as it moves to different contexts, or it operates in the same context, but as time goes on and things change. There's heterogeneity in the kinds, origins, and roles of variables. So we've got things such as BMI, whether you're stopping smoking and things like that. So there's lots of different things, as long as they can be quantified in some way. And crucially, unlike fields, for example, that Colin Rice was looking at, where you've got essentially a stable community of people working on the same thing, roughly the same thing, or the same line of research, the same research program over time, you've got lots of novel encounters with different biological and translational research endeavours and associate different data sets that engenders a different, a variety of ways in which existing variables can be engaged with. So obviously there are aspects of the constitution of variables in causal AI that are going to be different to other fields, but I think these limitations are kind of obvious, and fresh work can build around them. For now, I think it serves to reveal certain aspects of the constitution of variables that will take some grappling with. And crucially also, as you'll see, it foregrounds the iterativity and provisionality of the variables and their relations once constituted, which again is maybe different to some other fields. The life of a variable is quite cheap in causal AI, and therefore quite of use to us and those examining the practices of the constitution of variables. So, 3 examples, and they sort of lead from, okay, I've obviously shown you some DAGs and very briefly described their role in causal AI. How are they actually constructed? There's a number of means, but one of them is essentially to use domain expertise. Sometimes there'll be a modeler that will simply search the literature and identify what variables are useful, and of course the literature may give some indication of the kinds of causal relationships as well. Increasingly, people are using LLMs for this purpose as well, but a more traditional thing that's still being used consistently is using domain expertise, is getting a group of people that seem to know what they're talking about in the room. And this is a courtesy, this example also from talking to co-I on the project, Eliana Vasquez-Osorio. And she works on radiotherapy. She and her colleagues work on radiotherapy by the Manchester Cancer Centre and Christie Hospital in Manchester. And they work on head and neck radiotherapy and trying to characterise the contours of where radiotherapy needs to be applied, where it can be re-irradiated, because the actual 3D topography all changes and so forth, and it's very fascinating. But they found one thing where essentially, if there was people had radiotherapy to the medulla oblongata, which is sort of the top of the brainstem there, then they would have difficulty swallowing, dysphagia, as it's known. The clinical oncologists was kind of also puzzled a bit by the results. So why should that affect that? But a chance conversation with a speech and language therapist went, oh yeah, we know that. Because if somebody has a stroke there, they have trouble swallowing there afterwards. So that's kind of trivial, but that was a sort of chance encounter. But they wanted to explore this more systematically and more causally. So one first way they did it is to convene a multidisciplinary expert panel. This was the one in Manchester, involving a couple of clinical ecologists, like 4 medical physicists, the speech and language therapist that was mentioned before, a computer scientist that's Eliana, and causal inference expert as Matt Sperrin, who's one of the co-leads in China. And they essentially got together in a room not unlike this, with a few people online, and they basically chatted, what are the variables of interest, how should they be connected in a graph? And obviously, the Eliana and Matt, the causal inference experts, were essentially, with the assistance of a tool called Daggity, which helps with this, trying to identify a sort of a graph that would essentially that could be used for causal estimation. And so they came up with this, and apologies because I'm having to sort of use a published version, which is a very bad PDF, but hopefully it doesn't matter that much to look at the variables. It's more just to look at the pretty colours and the lines between them. So you've essentially got the dose for the medulla oblongata as the exposure treatment, and dysphagia 1 year after treatment as the outcome, and you want to essentially identify the relationship between that, measured with the various imperfect measures of dysphagia that exist. And so there are a number of different variables identifying the relationships between them, including 4 that were essentially confounders. They're common causes of the exposure and the outcome, so they need to be controlled. That was my fault. They need to be controlled, and also an instrumental variable needed to be identified as well. Where there are unmeasured confounders, an instrumental variable can be used essentially to deal with some of the sort of confounding bias that results essentially by creating mimicking the kind of randomization of treatment and control groups that you get in a randomized control trial. So this was the instrumental variable was identified from previous work that Eliana had been involved in trying to identify differences between the kind of contours, the kind of area that needs to be subject to the radiotherapy in a sort of head and neck context, and the divergences between that and one that's being identified by machine learning. So that then gets repurposed as this instrumental variable in this context in order to calculate the treatment effect. And I won't go into too much detail, but there are a number of variables that are identified through this. Again, not restricted to the ones that they definitely knew they had data on, but the ones that were thought to be relevant to the effect of interest. It turned out, luckily, that there was the data from the Christie Hospital that Eliana had access to allowed her to either identify directly the variables or to derive the variables from the data that already existed in order to make these calculations. This was then expanded out to an American group that was working on a similar issue. Same computer scientist, same causal inference expert, different set of oncologists, medical physicists, and different speech and language therapists and surgeons added into the equation. And they came up with an incredibly different DAG. So this is the British one, this is the American one, including different names of variables, many of them actually quite similar. There was actually a word that Eliana used with me, different realities with overlapping understanding. So I think it's very different kind of adjustment set of potential confounders. No need here for an instrumental variable. Different variables, numbers of variables, different kinds of variables, different numbers of arcs. So how does one identify then, or validate these DAGs and the realities they represent, given there's no ground truth, there's no definitive, this is actually the relationship between the dose of the medulla and dysphagia after 1 year. How do you do that? Well, one way you can do it is to, and I apologise in advance for the quality of this figure, but I'm having to rely on what's published here. I can show you a better version of the recording. Oh, that looks bad. Anyway, essentially to estimate the average treatment effects, so the average effects of the dose to the medulla and the effect on dysphagia, according to 3 different kinds of tests. And one way to gain more confidence that even though the DAGs are very, very different, that there's some kind of validity to them is they give roughly similar estimates. But as you can see, there's a number of problems with this. One, that doesn't really prove anything because they can both be flawed. The other is you can see the size of the confidence intervals, which is another problem. Now, this was based purely on some of the Christie data. More data is becoming available apparently now from the American side of it to estimate this, but some of the same problems remain. If you're drawing graphs using domain expertise, you can validate it or evaluate it using domain expertise. You can validate or evaluate it using these methods. You can conduct certain kinds of sensitivity analyses and robustness analyses, which allow you to test the assumptions of the DAG by changing some of the variables in them, maybe adding other variables. Just modelers can do that, conjectural variables, I'm sort of calling it, and sort of change some of the directionality of the arrows and to show you what it's doing. But that doesn't validate the DAG. So some people, so what it does do is it allows the inclusion of all relevant variables that domain experts have identified. Because it's made explicit, it allows ongoing analysis and discussion of the DAG and the variables. It allows the designation or even creation of new variables, including conjectural ones that I mentioned. There are some constraints due to the requirements of causal modelling in terms of what variables you include in there and the sort of the statistical control measures, but it's more or less unrestricted. So in that sense, it's more in line with Angela Potocznik's epistemic approach to variable choice, in which the variables included in a particular model should relate to the causal pattern of interest to a given problem, rather than being a lot more constrained, as in the sense of Colin Rice, but also Jim Woodward. Obviously, it includes formal representation of assumptions about the relevant variables and causal relationships. It enables the ontological flattening of the DAG, which has other kinds of problems, but at least it enables very different kinds of variables to be included. There's no real definitive benchmark or way to properly validate them. And although there's some guidance on DAGing protocols, there's no systematic approach to constituting variables and little guidance on domain expertise beyond sort of, talking about reaching a consensus. There are some protocols outlined, but they don't really seem to have any validation themselves or take up. So if that's the problem with using domain expertise, why not use a data-driven approach? And this is where causal discovery comes in. There are people that advocate, for example, this is a good example of this, identifying causal drivers of hypertension regarding particular genes. So this is a group that includes another co-I of Chai, identifying data, I think, from 5 different data sets, using their own sort of samples as well from kidney samples, I think it is, and using sort of hypertension groups and control groups in order to identify, learn a graph of the causal relationships between different genes. And as you can see, this is not a DAG. This is intended to sort of promote or provoke sort of a further hypothesis-driven research. But there are a number of issues with the data-driven approach of identifying a causal graph from this kind of data. One is that this is almost like a perfect example of this, too much of a perfect example of this, because this group involved the actual data collectors. It involved some of the people involved in the field who are actually shaping the definition of the problem and the research questions. So you essentially were not getting outside domain expertise. You had the domain expertise in the house. You had very simple and straightforward kinds of data that you were using to address a very, very specific question. And that's not always available. Often you're sort of needing to search for lots of different data, and then you've got the problem in terms of computational capacity and so on of the actual size of the search space that you're actually searching for, which, if it is not constrained by domain expertise in terms of what kinds of data you want, the kinds of edges, causal relationships that should be apparent, that should not be apparent in the data, that can kind of constrain the search space, then you're going to have problems. There's also a problem of course, you can get many different graphs that, as long as they meet the basic criteria, can't be distinguished between if one doesn't have domain expertise. So often domain expertise is involved. It's involved in the statement of the research problem and the question, the sourcing of the variables themselves, the selection of variables from those sources, then the refinement of those variables to make sure that they're at the appropriate level of granularity. So a classic example of this is, do you use, for example, overall cholesterol levels or levels of HDL or LDL cholesterol, because they'll be very, very different results in terms of hypertension, cardiovascular disease, and so on as a causal effect. And the semantics of the variables. So do the variables actually mean what they appear to mean from the labels of them? And usually only domain experts can identify that. The graph can then be learned constrained by formalized expert knowledge to say you really should not include edges between these variables because there cannot be a causal relationship there, or that there should be one because it's a very well-established causal relationship. Then the graphs can then be evaluated by the experts who provide feedback on changes required in various cycles of iteration as well. This is an ideal case. It's not often the case, but the idea is you can kind of iterate and produce ever more refined graphs. And a final example, which is a bit of a jump to a different example, is the diagnosis of inequities or unfairness. So to what extent is a variable an indicator of a sort of fair causal pathway or an unfair causal pathway? So in this example, for example, one might have a brain MRI, so this is more medical imaging, a brain MRI where the features of that get learned associated with obviously having Alzheimer's disease are the features of Alzheimer's disease that present in the brain, but also brain volume. Here, of course, there's an issue that patient age can affect brain volume, but this is, and obviously patient age is one of these sensitive attributes, it's a protected characteristic and so forth. So, there's a sort of sensitivity to potential issues of equity. But here, because patient age it has a direct causal pathway to increased risk of Alzheimer's disease, increased risk of the underlying condition of that being associated with disease features, that kind of causal pathway is not ruled out, and that remains a clinically relevant risk factor, whereas that's supposed to appear red. That looks very good. Whereas patient race as another sensitive attribute which can affect skin pigmentation, which is included in that image, which also lesion features are in there, is not an appropriate clinical risk factor because you've essentially got this collider of access to healthcare, which means that people of, and especially in the American context, which this is taken from, people of usually darker skin have less access to healthcare. Therefore, people of darker skin pigmentation are not necessarily included in the same levels as people with lighter skin in the training data sets, and therefore you can essentially miss certain things because it's not learning that statistical association in a way that is actually appropriate in the patient age example. So there is essentially key variables here are socially, culturally and politically pertinent, and their valence depends on those considerations and an understanding of the processes of data generation, process and use. So it's not just a technical question, but a social and ethical one as well. And the crucial thing is, what information do we have about the data generating process? Now, one way to counteract this for underrepresentation of certain groups in training data sets is, for example, in this example, counterfactual image generation. So if we have certain groups that are underrepresented in training data sets, one can identify, generate new images that concede those data sets that are otherwise underrepresented in them. So this is an example where various different parameters have been used to construct a structural causal model for the ways in which the causal generation process for key aspects of brain morphology. And again, this was informed by medical personnel informing the sort of causal AI modelers, and using causal generative modeling on the basis of this to generate counterfactual images. So, for example, here we've got the original image of a particular set of settings for the MRI scanner of a 60-year-old male with a set brain volume and ventricle, that's the bit in the middle, volume. And using this causal generative modeling, using that as SCM, with a different set of parameters or different settings on the MRI scanner, you get that image. If that male was 71 rather than 60, you get that image. If they're female, if they have that brain volume, if they have that ventricle volume. And by doing this, they can generate this counterfactual data. And they found that training using that rather than the existing training data set actually gave better results. So again, here the key variables are ones that are socially, culturally, and politically pertinent, but also pertinent in terms of medical systems and the different imaging settings and modalities that might exist, and also be a cause of shifts and drifts. So To conclude, there are a number of different variable constituting practices that we can see in causal AI. There's the problem definition, and that's incredibly important because this is one of the main things that essentially sets causal AI apart from non-causal AI, that it's very, very important to actually define the problem very, very clearly at the start of the process, rather than essentially work back from identifying all kinds of outputs and trying to identify where they came from. And here again, there's another a key role for engagement with multidisciplinary sort of stakeholders. There's the sourcing of data, which can be through a number of means. It can be in interaction with domain experts, either directly or through literature and so forth. It can be identified through particular data sets, and sometimes there's an opportunistic aspect to this in terms of what data you have access to. There could be ends-oriented identification of variables through their salience to equity and fairness issues, for example. Then there's issues of selection and choice, so how variables that come from those sources selected and chosen for inclusion in modelling. And then there's obviously the actual development of the model and graph itself. So it could be based on causal discovery, DAG drawing events, and involving also an appreciation of the data generation processes that will go into the actual causal estimation and identification of particular selection biases or other issues. And there's constraints obviously here in terms of computational capacity and time, need for sufficient sample sizes, the sparseness of the graph, the appropriate and meeting the appropriate conditions and assumptions and so forth. Then there's role assignment, so being able to try to identify, is this a confounder, is this a collider, and whether you need other kinds of variables in there. For example, augmenting it with instrumental variables, pruning it perhaps, removing certain kinds of variables, identifying statistical control measures for others. Then obviously running, testing and evaluating it. So this means obviously doing causal estimates, doing sensitivity analyses, having it evaluated in other respects, for example, by domain experts, or comparing it to known experimental results in the literature which haven't already worked your way into the modelling. And then obviously on the basis of the results, and maybe also running it again at different times, changing some of the variables, changing some of the relationships to test the robustness of it, and then iterating. So what it could end up with a sort of redefinition of the problem and beginning the process again. It could be moving to any of the other back to any of the other steps and running things again, maybe changing variables, identifying new data sources, identifying new ways to operationalize the variables in various ways and define the variables, and then going back. General points about the features of constituting variables in causal AI. It's very much a pragmatic and dynamic process. It's not dominated by formal modelling constraints or the tyranny of availability. In fact, it's almost like the tyranny of availability must be ignored in order for the modelling to be conducted properly. And again, that says nothing about the applicability of the tyranny of availability in other areas. There's also not necessarily a shortage of methods or modelling approaches in this sphere. That often the sort of restriction is being able to direct the right people to the right methods in the right workflows at the right time. Translational requirements, though, they're often apprehended through multidisciplinary encounters, be it with clinicians, it can be with patients and other lay persons, it can be with more fundamental biologists. That's often more of a restriction on variable constitution than some of the constraints often identified in the literature. And it's holistic. So, my suspicion that one needs to not identify just one bit of the process in terms of just looking at variable choice or variable definition, but look at the sort of whole process in a given way is essentially because variables so defined, selected, identified, have done so in relation to the wider set of variables that are identified, included in a graph, and evaluated as such. And so the evaluation can only be conducted in that context, in the context of the overall epistemic goals that motivate the whole endeavour. Now, because this is not simply just a formal technical process that one can just run, there are all sorts of judgment calls to be made. It's often been described, it's not often, but it's been described to me as needing certain black arts. And of course, this is not unique to causal AI. It's common of many fields that there are certain judgment calls that people have to make that they don't necessarily feel they have a sufficient basis or warrant to do so, but they have to do it for the purposes of their work. So one would be selecting from the cloud of covariates all the possible variables that might be included in models, dealing with unknown unknowns, because dealing with known unknowns is actually not relatively straightforward, but it's a lot clearer in the context of causal modelling than dealing with the things that you don't know are there. But at least when you're being explicit, you can somebody can easily point out that you've not included something. There's handling iterativity. So how do you handle these iterations of the process? How do you design workflows properly? And how does one use but not recapitulate domain expertise and knowledge, given that you don't really have access to a ground truth? So how do you how do you move beyond that and not just recapitulate it or entrench it if it may be an error? And I think one of the ways in which the reason why causal AI finds itself having to resort to black arts in order to handle these things is because it sort of falls in the middle between two poles of a more data-driven approach, which is essentially we identify all the kinds of data that we have in a particular area, crunch it into a big model, and then we identify, you have certain outputs. So that's everything in. And then you have a more cordon bleu approach that epidemiologists prefer, where try and use as few variables as possible so we can be very, very definite about what we're measuring and controlling and so forth. And the thing is that causal AI kind of fits in the middle here, and I think this is actually best. But causal AI fits in the middle where there's a balance to inclusion and exclusion of variables. There's judgment calls that have to be made, and there are trade-offs that need to be made for modelling and causal estimation and translational purposes as well. So what's the agenda now based on what I've said? So I think it's to explore and pursue the radical implication of the requirement to causally model the data generating process. And this I think is recognised more by some of the people that are sort of working at the coalface of causal AI, and not by some of the originators and pioneers of causal inference who think you don't need to do this, that the DAG will solve all the problems. But it clearly doesn't. It doesn't allow you to completely eliminate selection bias. It doesn't allow you to deal with all matters of control, because you may have decisions to make on whether you end up dealing with confounding bias or collider bias or different kinds of bias that you can't actually control both at the same time, because if you control one, you sort of push down on one and the other pops up at the other end. I think that we really need to apprehend, but also help inform the decision-making structures of modelling endeavours. For example, how, when, where, what use of domain expertise, and how that should be included in various stages of the process, because it's very much a free-for-all at the moment. The proper modes of validation and iteration, and I think we can draw on some of the literature and epistemic iteration there for how you actually do, how you actually validate, how you actually generate standards in the absence of an actual ground truth you have access to, and more generally to develop a systematic and robust framework concerning the constitution of variables. And I think that needs to be done as we've tried to across CHI so far, by conducting co-creative analyses and reworkings of data practices through engagement with our collaborators and a wider community. So I'll end there, and thank you very much for listening, and thank you for our funding.